Thank you all for joining online and for real. And yeah, as announced, I'm very pleased to talk about our project, Gender and Access to Rehabilitation, and also particularly about our approach of community-based participatory research, CBPR, a very specific approach. So our project is called GRACE, and GRACE is an acronym that stands for Gender Aspects in Rehabilitation of Persons with Amputations in Conflict-Affected Environments. It's a project that started in 2021, and it has numerous partners in different countries, particularly since it's the Swedish Research Council finance project. It's so the key partner is Linköping University in Sweden, and then many other partners as well. And so what we'll look into today is we'll start to have an overview into the GRACE project as such, its origins and the background to it. And then we'll also elaborate on what actually does that mean, community-based participatory research, so a very specific way of doing research, why we did it and how we did it. And then we will hear directly from our research participants, two groups, women with amputation in Cambodia and healthcare workers in Ethiopia. I'll then talk about the strengths and limitations of the two different studies, the recommendations that came out of these studies, and the lessons learned of the overall project. And I'll finish off with a few words on the ongoing and future work. Is there an issue?
Yeah, they said they don't see the presentation completely. They see it, but they see you and they don't see completely the format. C'est bon là? Let's do it just here. Voilà. Thank you.
So I hope you can see the screen now. So this is just a little overview about our colloque today, or what I will talk about. And let's get right into it. The GRACE project that was at the origin. What's the origin of this GRACE project? So now that doesn't work anymore. Right.
There's still just a small window open. Maybe this needs to be clicked on. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll move on as our assistant is trying to solve the technical problems. I'll move on. Thank you. So I always like to say the GRACE project is the baby of my PhD, because it is the early research of my PhD that allowed us to secure funding for this particular project. So in 2020, we published a study that was looking at actually a relatively large number of over 280,000 individual patient files. And these people were accessing rehabilitation centers in 14 countries, conflict-affected, low-resource countries, over a period of 30 years. So as Eric said, I worked in humanitarian services for several years, and these are also for the International Committee of the Red Cross, and these data and the patient files, they come from centers that are connected to the ICRC, so either directly to, belong to the ICRC or the majority supported by the ICRC. And what we saw in this study, you can see that here, doesn't work anyway, we will, we have over 70% of rehabilitation users being male. So this figure as such is not really a novelty, because we knew that from the annual reports, and even myself working in rehab centers for many years, the majority of patients in these rehab centers were male. And there is also an explanation for that. If we look into conflict, I would say the humanitarian narrative around that is that it is men who fight, who are combatants, they are the ones who get injured on the battlefield. They have a disability, an amputation or a spinal cord injury, they need a wheelchair and a prosthesis, and this is why they are the majority in the rehab centers. This is true, for example, if we look at the war in Ukraine. So I've been myself to Ukraine last year, and it's true, Ukraine is what you would call like a classical conflict. You have a front line, you have two armies fighting each other. The proportion of civilian casualties is relatively small. However, the countries I was studying and the countries that don't make it so much into the headlines, but that are facing conflict, ongoing conflict for years and decades, they are countries called in a situation that's called protracted crisis. And that is the typical conflict pattern. And it is really, it's huge countries that we usually don't hear that much about compared to Ukraine, for instance. So we're looking at Mali, Sudan, South Sudan, Congo, Afghanistan, Iraq, also Palestine, countries that face decades of ongoing conflict. And the conflict patterns in these countries are acute fighting, ceasefire, simmering violence, etc., etc. That is the typical pattern. And there's a saying, the first victim of a conflict is the healthcare system. So what happens in these countries is, yes, there are combatants getting injured, but the huge problem causing disability is the collapse of health systems. And countries with low resources, if we look at the disability population in these countries, as a matter of fact, the majority are not men, but the majority of people with disabilities in low resource countries are women. And the reason they have a disability more than men, there are many reasons for that. Most of these are related to the fact that they are women. So gender-related reasons, that's one thing. So we have the overall figures of these countries, more women than men with a disability. And then there's a lot of evidence also meanwhile that shows that women in general face difficulties accessing accessing health services, but also accessing the labor market, accessing education. And women with a disability, it's even more difficult. There's this factor that we call intersectionality. So women that are poorer because they face access difficulties to education, and they have a disability because they face access barriers to healthcare systems. So it's more likely for a woman to develop a disability compared to men. So you would assume that you should at least see something like an equal number in rehabilitation centers. And our figures show that of all the countries we looked into, including the 2 countries we ended up doing field research in, there's nowhere we see female majority. Some countries are fairly equal, but in most countries there's a dominance of males. And the same applies to age groups. If we look at the different age groups here, we see, yes, there's a big majority of the young adults. Here you can count in, this includes most probably the combatants. But let's look at the under 5-year-olds. So that we can clearly not count them in as war-injured combatants. And still, we have almost 60% boys, only a bit over 40% girls accessing rehabilitation. Same for the old age group, over 60 years, there's 70% of a male population in the rehab centers. In an age group where women have a higher life expectancy and women are known to develop disabilities, particularly in that old age. So the narrative of explaining this with combat injury is not really holding up. And here the same for the different, for the different reasons for attendance. So the different health conditions, they're called reasons for attendance because there's not necessarily medical personnel in rehab centers to do a diagnosis. These are the reasons for people to attend rehabilitation services. And I'll just pick out one health condition, which is polio. So in polio, if we look at prevalence data, polio, the virus, does not distinguish between male and female. However, when it comes to the development of the disabling post-polio syndrome, there is a majority of females. So there's more females being affected by post-polio syndrome than males after having had the polio virus, after having been sick from the polio virus. And despite that, and we all agree polio is not connected to conflict directly, polio is a clear indicator of a fragile health system, and still we have a majority of 66% males.
Just a quick question. Then this is from different several countries.
All the countries.
All the countries. Yeah.
Yeah. So all this data finally led to us securing funding for the GRACE project. And the GRACE project has 3 objectives. The first one is to understand sex differences in demographic factors, amputation cause, and clinical characteristics among rehab users with amputation in conflict or low-income countries, so a retrospective data analysis, and then 2 field studies to understand the perspectives of those directly affected, women and men with amputation, access, acceptability, and perceptions of rehabilitation. And the last objective, to understand the perspective of health workers, so those who deal with these people with amputation, on how gender impacts access to services, service delivery, and health outcomes. Because our assumption is also that there is always a gender aspect also in service provision, so we would like to hear the perspective of health workers as well. The first objective of the GRACE project was to look into data on persons with amputation. Here we looked into over 28,000 patient files from 5 countries. The countries are Cambodia, Myanmar, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Sudan. Now, these 5 countries are all in a situation of either protracted conflict or, in the case of Cambodia, a post-conflict situation where even decades after ceasefire and peace, you still have mine victims, people getting killed or amputated by a mine every year. So all these countries are affected by conflict in a certain way. And all these countries have a huge weapon contamination, so landmine victims exist in all of these countries. So what we saw here is that 85% of rehab users with amputations are male. In this case, however, it's difficult to basically come to the assumption based on these data to say women face access difficulties, because it's difficult to compare this to prevalence data. When we look at the cause of amputation, here the population with a non-traumatic amputation is merely over 25%, and 73% have had a traumatic amputation of this population. And this is a reverse pattern to most countries. You may know that the NCD is an increasing problem in low-income countries, diabetes, and diabetes caused amputation. And in these countries, the majority of amputations is non-traumatic. Here we have this mix with a conflict situation, and there's no prevalence data to compare it to, because we have, of all the population we looked into, almost half of them have a conflict-related injury, and over 30% landmine-caused amputation. And we know from the landmine data as such that the large majority of landmine victims continue to be male, even over 90% in the countries. So it's difficult to really draw this assumption that there are indeed access barriers, but it's data that provide us information about the sex distribution. And there were some hints. So I'll just pick out one of these hints. If we looked at the living environment of our population, and actually for a woman with coming from a rural background, she's less likely to access rehabilitation compared to a woman coming from an urban background. So a woman from an urban living environment, there's almost a 20% proportion of females attending rehabilitation. So we're back at this intersectionality thematic where the combination of being female with a disability and coming from a rural background makes it probably more difficult to access rehab. But all of this we wanted to know exactly from the communities where these situations happen, where people acquire an amputation, and therefore we chose a research approach called community-based participatory research, CBPR. CBPR is a very, I would say, a very special approach to do research. It has a number of specific features that, in my view, that make the approach very, very special and also not a classical way to do research. And I'll share a few features, key features of the CBPR approach for you to understand what it means. So one typical characteristic of CBPR is that we have the researchers and there's the community where the research is going to take place. And both groups are considered experts of equal importance and on an eye level. So the researchers don't arrive in a community and they carry out their research and they leave with the results, with their findings, but the community the research is being carried out is representatives of the community are as much experts as the researchers coming to carry out the research. And this includes a mutual learning process. So mutual learning is a key feature of CBPR. Partners of CBPR, of any of these projects, are involved in all stages of the project. So that means that the community and all partners involved in the research project, they participate in designing research questions, designing the questions being asked to the interviewees. They are involved in interpreting the results and particularly also in formulating actionable recommendations. So the uptake, the research dissemination and the research uptake, partners are involved in that to also own what to do with the findings. Capacity building is another feature of the CBPR approach. So research capacity building in the areas, in the communities, in the context where the project is carried out. And the idea is that the findings really benefit all involved in the project, the research participants, the researchers, the community. So it's really the idea of benefit and of a long-term commitment. So a commitment that goes beyond the end of the research project, because the overall idea of CBPR is to work towards more health equity and something called social transformation. So the idea is that these findings have an effect on a long term after the end of a particular project. Now, how did we do that? So we had a number of, I here have a collage for you that shows what kind of activities that involved. For instance, we had visits. I had the chance to go to Cambodia once. Unfortunately, I couldn't go to Ethiopia to talk to the research partners and affected people directly. Then here on the top right, we see a team that is called Local Research Advisory Committee, LRAC. So these committees were the ones who designed, interpreted, and shared the research questions and findings, who worked collectively with us on that. And as you can see in these LRAC committees, were composed of different kinds of stakeholders: men, women, people with disability, people without a disability, people with invisible disabilities, and also other activities that took place. So here's a research, there's a capacity building workshop of our local researcher, training their team of research assistants, many flip charts being used, and also ongoing online meetings back and forth between or across the oceans, so to say. So this is how we formalized the CBPR approach in that project. So we ended up having now 76 interviews from both countries. And the interviews were held in Khmer language in Cambodia and Amharic language in Ethiopia, and then transcribed verbatim, translated into English. For these languages, you cannot pop a document into DeepL and have it translated directly. So really tedious work to get all this material translated. And we ended up having, in terms of persons with amputation, we have 16 interviews from females, 16 from males in Ethiopia, 2 women and 8 men with amputations. And for the healthcare workers, we have 6 each for the Cambodia group, and 4 female, 18 male healthcare workers from Ethiopia. So you can see it was relatively difficult to recruit female research participants in Ethiopia. And that is already a finding in itself for a gender project. And now let's look into 2 of the studies. So I'll present 2 of the studies today. Access to rehabilitation in Cambodia. 12 women with amputation. There were, so our research partners conducted semi-structured interviews, and as an analysis, we used reflexive thematic analysis. That is a research approach where the main goal is to tell a story and to really illustrate the story of those being interviewed and their perspective on with regards to certain research questions. Reflexive thematic analysis acknowledges that whoever interprets the data comes to the table with all their biography, their personality, their values, their experience. So the interpretation is by nature subjective, and that is part of the approach. So I was not the lead research in both of these studies. I was part of the research team, but I was not leading on the analysis, but just also to illustrate. So if I come and have data in front of me and I interpret them, very obviously I interpret them against the background of my years in humanitarian services, of me being a physiotherapist coming from a rich country with a feminist value set, and all of this feeds into the way how data are interpreted. And this positionality of people in interpreting the data, that shouldn't be made clear during the research process to say this is my background, this is what I bring to the table, and this is what influences the way I identify themes out of this data. That's a part of the process. And for the Cambodia data, 6 themes were identified. And you can imagine if we look at these themes, they are all interrelated and interconnected. And we'll go through them with some real data, some contributions of these women for you to see what the theme may mean. So we'll start with the family dimension. So one woman said, "My relatives discriminate and despise me. They said I am an unlucky person and it is my fault." So this is shows already how far the stigma goes right into the family even. When we look at the theme of financial impact, that's a theme that is a key feature in almost all interviews. One woman said, "No one picks me up at the rehab center, and my husband is the main supporter of my family. If he picks me up from there, we will have no income." So that is a typical contribution and also a typical theme in many countries where it's almost either or. So if I want to support one of my family members to do their rehabilitation, during that time I can't make money, there's no income, and the financial burden on a family, on care for assistive technology, rehabilitation care for a person with disability is extremely costly and an extreme barrier. Also, the role of women was a theme, where one woman said, "Every day I feel very difficult because I cannot do anything. I want to walk or do everything as before so I can help my husband. After he comes back from work, he has to do household chores, such as lifting heavy objects, cleaning cabinets or high places that I'm unable to reach." So in societies where the roles are very clear, what's the role of a woman, what's the role of a man, it's obviously also had a lot to do with your identity and how an amputation or disability forces you to reflect on your identity, and also themes of shame and guilt are visible through these quotes. And then we have the theme of social isolation and exclusion. A woman saying, "I feel very shy to meet other people. I stay in a rented house and visit my hometown only. I haven't joined any events or ceremonies because I hardly walk and feel shy to go outside." And these events and ceremonies are very important and key in Cambodian society. So it also interrupts the normal life course for these women. The care journey is another important theme with a quote where a woman says, "After surgery, the surgeon did not give any information about the rehab center. I got treatment at the hospital and they told me to go home only. So I don't know where to go for the prosthesis. That is also a very typical situation. In many, many countries, rehabilitation as a service and assistive technology is not part of the health system. It's not part of the typical continuum of care. Often it's a sector that's under the social system or under some charity or some church or faith-based organization. So the health person in the hospital doesn't really know, or maybe not even care so much, where does the patient get their wheelchair or their prosthesis from. So it's like separate identities, and the outcome is very often that people are discharged and they don't know what happens next. So also an important issue to be aware of. Psychological distress was another theme, with a woman saying, I wanted to commit suicide because I felt so stressed. I did not want to survive. I was in the hospital for many months. And also here, it's a red flag that was that came out in almost all interviews. So it's really something to consider and to be aware of, that this is part of a coping journey, I would say, and to realize that these thoughts are prevalent in a population of persons with amputation, and that it's really something to be very alert about in the early phase after amputation. So this was the Cambodia study. We'll have a look again at the 6 themes. Now, what strengths and limitations did that study have? So the huge strength of that study was that it's a research project that was carried out in a community by people from the community who are part of the context and the culture and know very well the situation. So that's a huge strength for to interpret the findings and to come up with recommendations that work for that particular community context and culture. As a limitation, we only had a chance to do that research outside the capital of Cambodia, Phnom Penh, and we didn't get to carry out research in rural settings where most probably the situation is even more challenging. So we can't talk about that context. For this study, we were an all-female research team. And we know that it could have been beneficial to have a mixed research team, particularly with regard to a gender research study. And another limitation was our interviewer, who identified the women and who carried out the interviews with them. She was a prosthetist orthotist, so she was a service provider herself. She was part of the context and the culture, so that's the big strength of it. At the same time, we do not know what answers women would have given if the interview hadn't been done by someone who is also doing the service provision. So what do they say about the services provided? So that is also something to be aware of, that her role may have played a role also in the way the women responded. The recommendations coming out of this study were firstly it's absolutely crucial to increase awareness and reduce stigma about amputation, about women with amputation, and this on all levels. So really on a family level, public level, as well as on a healthcare worker level and policy level. And to consider and to address these very specific, gender-specific challenges that the women shared with us. And very importantly, to improve referral channels so that people in the hospitals have information where to go to for prosthetic fitting and rehabilitation. And now we'll move to Ethiopia, excuse me. So in Ethiopia, the study was on the perspectives of healthcare workers. workers. 22 in total, 4 of them female, same approach, semi-structured interviews, reflexive thematic analysis, and here we identified 5 themes. So again, I wasn't sitting in the front seat, I was part of the research team. We had a research lead, a male research lead for this study, and the main researcher is doing the analysis with our input. And these are the 5 themes that emerged, but also, again, these themes are all interrelated, and you'll see it in this graph here, that there are also a number of sub-themes that belong to the main themes came out of this data. So you can see there's really rich data with a lot of information. And we'll look into a few of them now. So here we have a male orthopedic technician talking about what was then identified as the theme of fear and violence as a barrier. And he says, although a woman has no physical disability, she's vulnerable to physical violence. When she is disabled, she becomes more susceptible. A physically disabled woman could be exposed to violence when there is no one. She couldn't escape the attack by running away due to her disability. So that is a quote. First of all, I think it's quite troubling to realize that even if the rehab center is there and the woman can liberate herself from her household duties, she risks attacks and violence by getting there as a barrier to accessing rehab. Then also culture and beliefs were identified as a huge barrier, with a female community-based rehab worker saying, "We used to see a disabled female who was tied in the kitchen like a sheep. We asked why they did that upon her, and they told us that when the guests see the disabled girl, they may say that it is due to a curse or something from genetics. Therefore, it is good for her to be tied in the kitchen rather than somebody insulting us," her father said. He confidently said that he tied her. That is a quote that contains so much information about beliefs, about culture, about collective society, where the individual counts less than the reputation. So there's a lot in such a quote, where we can also see we can't just address that by whatever proclaiming human rights. Resources, quality service, and rehab system was another theme, with a male physiotherapist saying, if we come to marriage, when they become pregnant, it is difficult for them to move using artificial means. It may have weight and have more effect on the women, so artificial is more suitable for men. So I think you understand that with artificial, that means the prosthetic limb. And here I have to say that was very interesting for me reading the data. This is a kind of quote that in different shapes and formulations, it came up repeatedly. Male healthcare workers talking about women in need of a service, and women either have their period or they're pregnant. And because of that, it's difficult to provide services because it's difficult with the appointments, and so basically this is what I'm saying, that's what I'm reading with the background that I have. But I found this very interesting, these kind of concepts that it's difficult to work with women because there's always when they have their period, they can't come to appointment, and then they get pregnant, and they're heavier, and then they can't use the prosthesis, etc. So I found this very interesting as statements. But the person also said, our prosthesis is old. It was given even before I joined this hospital. It is not up to date. We are still using the same prosthesis. It is too heavy for women. So in these countries, as you can imagine, you don't see the fancy prostheses, the super expensive ones you see in rich countries or you see at the Paralympics. And as a matter of fact, that's also a quote that will come again. Like so many medical devices, they were designed by men, for male bodies, and the prostheses are not designed for female bodies, and females show really clearly how more difficulties adjusting to them, using them. That's also shown in many different studies, where even it was found that women are given used prostheses, and whereas men get tailor-made prostheses. So the device in itself constitutes a barrier for women with amputation. Experience was another theme, with an interesting quote from a male orthopedic surgeon saying, "When it happens to men, the probability of them coping is high because their wives support them. But I don't see much in turn among men when their wives get amputated." So the experience of amputation is also gendered because of the difference in support. Outcomes of rehabilitation, with a male physiotherapist saying, women with amputation had problems such as the prosthesis being tight and not comfortable, and the amputated limb becoming weaker. So again, it shows that the prostheses are not necessarily made well for women, and that the health outcome, the functional outcome, is different because the device is not necessarily of the same quality for the women compared to men. So this was just a bit of an insight into healthcare workers' perspectives. Here you have the graph of the different themes and sub-themes again. And we will now also look at strengths and limitations. So the strength is exactly the same project carried out in the community context and culture, where the findings and the recommendations should be of use. And a major one limitation of this study is that we were interested in healthcare workers' perspective, and also their gender playing a role in what they said. So they made comments about people, particularly women with amputation, and here we don't have the perspective of women with amputation responding to what healthcare workers said. So it really only shows the healthcare workers' insights. And since the large majority of the interviewees were male, it also shows a lot of the male perspective. So as you can imagine, if you do an interview and you want someone to share their perspectives on a group of people, you will learn about the group of people, but at the same time, the person also reveals a lot about themselves. And this is something I found visible in particularly when male healthcare workers are talking about women with a disability. I found this very interesting, but it's also a limitation that it's not really a balanced view in that sense. The recommendations that came out of this study is crucial to advocate for gender-inclusive rehabilitation services, and that it really needs policy changes for the financial constraints, but also for the limited decision-making that women have, and to address transportation issues that were also mentioned. There's also a call for projects on community-based rehabilitation that empower women economically, just such as occasional trainings, income-generating activities, and a key recommendation also to invest in gender-diverse workforce, so that in a future project we probably have a bit of a different ratio of male and female healthcare workers, because the healthcare workforce is dominated by male healthcare workers. So it's a recommendation again on a policy level to really invest in a more gender diverse workforce. So I would like to now come to some lessons learned of the overall project. So not only the 2 studies, and we'll go through the whole bow together to look at the overall project. So we started off with the idea, we decided on the approach, CBPR, we've secured funding and identified partners. So all of this is basically what happened on our desks when we launched the project. And then came the phase where training took place with the teams in the field, but then also them giving training to their research assistants and their teams. And on that local level also the adaptation of the CBPR approach to their specific contexts and the implementation. And then after the implementation, the phase of transcribing all these 76 interviews, translating them into English, the phase of the analysis. Now we're in the phase of write-up and lacking or coming up with dissemination. So this is one form of dissemination, and very important, the uptake, very important for the CBPR project. So if you look at this whole bow, you can imagine that that is a project that requires a lot of activities that are not the pure, we have a research question, we collect data, we analyze data, publish, and move on to the next. So it's really a very holistic way that also requires a lot of time on different levels that do not end up in a publication. So it's really a project, as I said before, that aims at more health equity and social transformation, and therefore needs time, needs engagement of many, many different people, and more than just writing up research, but really to achieve something in the particular context. Our next steps, so data analysis and dissemination is still ongoing. You see, we now have only looked at one group of the Cambodians with amputation and the Ethiopian healthcare workers. So there's still data from the other groups to be analyzed and disseminated and published. And all this research uptake and creating actionable recommendations with the local research advisory teams is also something that will still happen over the next months. And there's a few discussions about secondary data analysis. Good, so this is what we looked at today. All these points about the GRACE project, the CBPR, we heard about what women with amputation in Cambodia had to say, what healthcare workers in Ethiopia shared with us. We looked at the strengths, limitations, recommendations of the studies, the lessons learned, and the next steps in the project. And so what is left for me now is to thank you for your interest, in our project, in our findings, and I also would like to mention all that were involved and engaged and committed to our project. And yeah, now we still have some time, and I'm looking forward to your questions offline and online. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, well, thank you, Nell. And of course, we also accept questions written or spoken in French and can translate. I forgot to say that in the beginning. And maybe just as a sort of a first observation, I mean, what I've noted a few questions as well, but actually what you just presented shows how rich qualitative data can be compared to, you also showed quantitative data in the beginning, but sort of giving a glimpse into those situations that people sort of face in their context. I mean, that's just remarkable, and I think that's one of the strengths of qualitative research. And sort of it's on a human side, it's really touching to hear about stories that someone is confined to the kitchen and is not allowed to see the visitors because it could show that there is, or it could suggest that there is a spell on the house because somebody has an amputation. I mean, that's heartbreaking, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So that's just an observation, and it shows that collecting data and only collecting quantitative data will not do justice, actually, and might not actually help changing things to the better of people if we don't have these aspects. And well, it might speak more to decision makers if this is presented actually in the best format possible to those who make decisions about resources in the countries being allocated to rehabilitation or to other sectors. So that's just as a sort of a first observation. But I'm sure there are some questions also, either in the room or online.
Question online, but they said thank you for this interesting and meaningful presentation.
Thank you. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, thank you. And just also before, if there's any other questions coming up, also in response to you, Eric, I think it really needs this marriage of both. And I would agree. Of course, decision makers, they want data, and the data, let's say, quantitative data, and they are absolutely crucial. But not everybody has a statistics background, and sometimes quantitative data are difficult to understand. And such kind of stories and studies can also be read if you don't necessarily have a research background. I think that's very important. And in countries, these women, they so hardly get a voice. So just giving them a stage to share their insights, and also the men just the same, I think that is absolutely crucial for countries where this is so hidden. And yeah, and I agree. I think there's a lot of beliefs still, and I think that wasn't very different couple of decades or centuries back in our context. Yeah. But like giving these people a stage, I think that is absolutely crucial, and that's the beauty of such a project, that you will never find out collecting health data from a health dispensary or something. Yeah.
Yeah, I have someone that wrote, how can we overcome the local culture regarding amputees to make them more acceptable issue of the woman tied in the kitchen?
How? Let me just repeat it so that people hear.
How can we overcome the culture, the local culture regarding amputees to make them more acceptable?
Yeah. How can we overcome the local beliefs and the local culture to address a situation like the woman being tied to the kitchen? Well, the answer lies in the context itself. So, as I said, I'm presenting data that was collected, translated, interpreted by our local research teams. They did the huge bulk of work, and they are in the community, and we have the local research advisory committee. So I cannot give I cannot give a suggestion. I'm not in the situation to do that. It's something that needs to be discussed in the culture, in the community itself. That's one thing, and the other thing is that these things clearly also take time. As I said in my presentation, you don't come with your document waving the human rights charter or whatever, but you need to come little by little, and this such kind of research is the first step towards more awareness.
Yeah, you had it in one of your recommendations, reduce the stigma. I mean, so that's much broader than a discussion around accessing rehabilitation or other specialized services. It has to do with a sort of a changing stigma or changing ways how people with disabilities, be it amputation or something else, be presented or be visible in the society, in everyday life. I mean, if you never see a disabled person, for example, in a movie, being on a job, I mean, they're just not, and it has been like that, as you've said, decades ago in our society. I mean, if you don't see people are confined to homes or their own house, actually never seen in the street or in social roles. Yeah. It will not change. So I think that it cannot be actually the task of affected people with a disability and their families. It is a thing on the level of society.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this awareness raising also always has to spread around. And I think we need to look at this like the access barriers are the tip of the iceberg. Yeah. And what is hidden are these huge issues of gender roles, stigma, beliefs, also superstition, financial barriers. So all of this is actually invisible underneath, and it needs addressing in different ways and different actions. Yeah.
Just one quick question with regard to, looking at the time as well, one quick question with regard to the methodology of CBPR. You mentioned that it's not defined in the beginning exactly what you will ask and how you will collect the data, so because the community has such a strong role. So how do you write a protocol actually in the beginning? You need to have sort of a plan how to do and get also funding for it. But for a funder, you cannot say just, oh, we will meet the community and then decide how we do the research. Yeah. So isn't that sort of a tension or a conflict?
I mean, that is certainly an issue that we discussed a lot, because if you need funding for a project which is by nature necessary, it is almost a contradiction to the original idea. The original idea is that the community identifies a problem and then develops a project out of it, and then there's funding, and then the community develops the project further. But there can be communities that don't see the problem, and you arrive with your Western view and you're like, oh, we have this gender project and maybe the community doesn't see that problem. However, I found in both contexts we looked into, we arrived with a research question, but the project was really molded to the community, and it was all the community contributing to the idea and how the interview guide had to be set up, how it had to be piloted, how to identify participants, which are the places where we want to carry out the research. So all of this was really designed by the community. So the let's say the overall research idea was there with the funding, but the rest was really defined in the community. The lack was not identified by the community, but as we moved on, it really becomes their project.
Okay, so are
they've been communicating online, participants, so I don't know if you want to read what they wrote, or...
Yeah, maybe later on, if there's a specific question I can...
Well, they've talked about AI and data analysis with AI, but I see that some people have answered online.
Yeah. Okay, it's great that it has stimulated an online conversation that we are not aware of right here. Okay. Are there any other questions now in the room? So thanks again, Nell, for presenting this and discussing with us, and all the best for the coming steps.
Exactly, and especially for the social transformation we want to see. Thank you, and thanks for your interest, and wishing you all a good day and rest of the week.
Thanks.
Okay.
Social transformation, yes.